Ladies and gentlemen, I am Mamta Khatri and I will be your host for the session today. Good afternoon and welcome to the WebEx session on Is it time to join the Indian gaming industry hustle? Unraveling the legal juggernauts and opportunities. The session will be presented by Christina Thakor and Roland Landers. And from NDA team, we have Ranjana Adhikari, Gowree Gokhale, and Tanisha Khanna. Please note that this session will be in listen mode only and will last for about 60 minutes, of which first 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on panel discussion. The remaining time will be available for question and answer. Requesting all the participants to be on mute mode for the session. You can post your questions in the chat window while the panel discussion is on. The moderator will queue up the questions for the speakers accordingly. Should you need any assistance during the conference call, you can use the chat option. Do note that this conference is being recorded. I now welcome our session presenters, Ranjana Adhikari. Ranjana co-heads and gaming law practice at NDA. Gowree Gokhale, a veteran lawyer with expertise in technology, media, gaming, telecom, IP laws, and commercial laws. Christina Thakor, founder of 1710 Gaming UK, as well as the All-in Diversity Project. She is based out of London. Roland Landers, CEO of All India Gaming Federation. He is based off in Mumbai. Tanisha Khanna, senior member, gaming law practice at NDA. Over to you, Ranjana, our moderator this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Mamta. I think, firstly, an extremely warm welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon, perhaps an early morning for those of you who are joining us from London as well. Especially Christina, Roland, thank you so much for being part of this. I know that we've already had an introduction for both of you. And I, in particular, told them we'll keep it brief, although there's so much that we can talk about each of you and your 25 years each of experience that both of you share. And it's just brilliant having, known you for a large part of those years as well. So welcome to the session with us today. We are very, very glad to have you on board with us. All right, I think as the session title clearly suggests, it's an Indian hustle for the Indian gaming industry. And the focus of today's session is this really the right time to focus on this country? Is it really the right time to be a part of this industry? And why are we really talking about this? I think the one clear thing that the COVID lockdown has really helped us all realize that entertainment and on-demand entertainment in general is what is probably doing the best in terms of business. We obviously spent 2 sessions over the last 2 days talking about a very interesting facet of other kind of on-demand content. And today's focus, of course, is on the gaming content. Now, we've got a very mixed bucket of audience today here with us. We've got people from the industry, of course. We've got lawyers from the fraternity, both in India and overseas. We've got students. We've got investors. So it's a very interesting, healthy bucket of people coming to hear us. For some of you, some of these things might be basic, but for some of them, it would be an interesting thing to know about. So please bear with us if we make a few references for something you already know about. It's for the good of the audience as a whole. I think to kick off the session, the first and foremost thing I just kind of like to set out how and what we're going to be covering today. There are some very key important game products that we talk about. When we say the words gaming/gambling, it's really used very interchangeably in the Indian context, although that might not be the case. Legally, that is the case. So every time any of the speakers use either of the phrases, it's really the gaming industry that we're talking about. We will be focusing our energy today on some kind of game formats which are very popular in India. So we've got online rummy, online poker. There is a huge interest in, of course, fantasy sports products. We also have a lot of burgeoning interest in sports betting, obviously. And you've got the digital skill gaming formats as well. although there are a lot of other formats out there in the market, in the interest of time, we will be focusing our energies particularly on these formats and in general, a lot in terms of the investment opportunities, both domestic and overseas. Now, from there on, I think let's begin with today's session. Roland, I think it would be perfect to actually begin with you today. And you're the right person from the industry to perhaps ask this question. Could you probably, for the audience, help set out what's the real potential of the Indian gaming industry? If you have some statistics to share with us, that would be great to really understand. Roland, we can't hear you, so if you could unmute yourself, please.
Can you? Hi, Ranjana. Thank you.
We can. Thank you.
Yeah. So, as you know, for the context that we operate in, which is within the Indian gaming industry, really the subscription or real money-led businesses. So, I would rather talk about that side of the business. Recently, we had the KPMG came out with the Picky Frames report also because of the Corona issue. They could not launch it during the Picky Frames, which never happened. But the report was, launched, and the figures that we had shared with them. So for that part, so to qualify at the beginning, I'll be talking about the real money games of skill essentially, and there, the potential is very high in the sense, some of the figures that we shared collectively, the businesses that make up this side of the industry is in the range of a little over $500 million in the current uh, at present right now, and the growth rates are also pretty robust. I'm not referring to this slight blip here in this a few months where there are no live sports happening. But if you look at what was maybe till December end or even January, then pretty much a little over $500 million is what the industry size is right now, and growing at about 25 to 30% CAGR. So there is immense potential to grow. Each of the business verticals have in some, obviously, there are a large set of players. In some, there are recently, about 8 to 10 good frontline players, and so all of it are pretty well stacked up right now. And I feel that it has immense potential, as it has, as you rightly alluded to, in the days that of the lockdown that we've seen in the last 3 weeks. At least there have been scores of stories in the media that speak about. Um, some of the businesses have seen a real hockey growth, whereas some, drop because of the absence of live sports. So it's a mixed bag for the industry right now. But when talking about the potential, definitely it is immense.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, Roland. Very interesting that you bring up about live events. Maybe I'll pick your brains a little more when we're discussing about DFS in particular. Christina, I think this is a good time to segue in terms of what the foreign investors' perspective would be. Now, I particularly wanted to hear from you that what do you think would be of interest from a foreign investor's perspective? You already heard what I had to say as well as what Roland had to say in terms of the opportunities that the market presents. But what out of this is really a foreign investor's or an operator's interest area as such?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everybody. I think for me, and I think for the whole industry, India is one of the most exciting markets. It is, without doubt, the biggest sports betting market. You've got the US there with its kind of American football, its basketball, all the rest of it, but that compares nowhere near to the Indian sports betting market, and cricket in particular. So that alone makes India a hugely, hugely interesting destination. And I think when you're an overseas operator, you're an investor, whether you're actually based in India or outside of India, there are a number of things that you have to bear in mind. firstly, India is a federal nation. So you have federal laws, but actually gambling sits with the states. So when you look at India, you're looking at state by state. You're looking at lots of jurisdictions. And then it tends to be land-based. That becomes very expensive. So unless you're an existing bricks and mortar operator, there's no point looking at it. So for most of your overseas operators and investors, we're talking about online predominantly. And that's where it starts to get tricky. Once you've decided you're going to come into the market, you then have to look at what is accessible. What are the products you can offer? Obviously, poker, rummy, fantasy sports. They're the clear front runners in the marketplace at the moment, but they have a limited and decreasing audience. And it's a niche audience. You know, as products go, you're tying the player up for a longer period of time. Increasingly, you mentioned at the start, it's a consumer generation. You want that instant gratification. You don't want 3 to 4 months watching an event play out. So you could look at that. There's also bingo. The laws around bingo seem to be quite grey. So that's something you could go into. And of course, there's social games as well. The big commercial opportunity, however, bar none, is going to be sports betting and online slots or casino. Not so much the table games, the roulettes, the blackjack, but the casual slots play. That's where the mass market appeal is, the instant gratification and the money. Clearly, it's also illegal. So one of the things operators and investors might start to look at now is start to offer free play, social betting sites, start to build up that community, that brand awareness, that player engagement, and a database for when regulation comes.
That's a wonderful synopsis of, I think, an important facet of the interest area that even we have seen. We also have seen absolutely rising interest in sports betting, which is what I've saved as the best for last. So sports betting is what we'll take right at the end, of course. And of course, you also mentioned about the casino games, of course. We haven't really focused today's session on that, like you very correctly said, because of the illegality attached to it. But it's fair to say free-to-play versions are something which are becoming very popular indeed. I think one very quick question that I had for you again, Tina, from a foreign investor's perspective, do they typically look at markets only if it's regulated? What I mean by that is if it's always in as a licensed regime and it's a white market as opposed to gray market. I do know that different operators may have a different approach, but what's your experience been in this case?
Well, I think you kind of answered your own question there. And I won't go too much into it now unless you want me to, because I think we're going to look at regulated markets. So do you want to pick that up now?
We could do that later as well. So just maybe you could keep this in mind.
Well, I would say it's exactly as you say. It depends on the operator. It depends upon your appetite for risk. There are white markets, but compliance comes with a cost. There are black markets where you go in there, you are going to get burnt. And then, of course, we have this wonderful raft in the middle, which is a grey market, which I define either as there is no specific regulation, so the law is silent, or there is regulation, but it cannot be enforced. So for me, it's literally, if you pardon the pun, horses for courses based on risk to revenue.
Yes, I think I understand where you're coming from. And I think on that note, it would be the right time to get the Indian law experts on board here and maybe throw some light as to why we're really talking about this whole license versus a gray market regime. So perhaps, Tanisha, we could, seek your assistance here. Perhaps you could give us a brief background on how really the interplay of laws work in India, and maybe just focus a little bit in rummy, poker, DFS, but we obviously have that in the later part of discussions. So maybe a brief about how the interplay of laws really work in India.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. So as Christina very rightly pointed out, we have a federal system here in India insofar as gambling laws are concerned. So under the Constitution of India, each state has been given the power to regulate betting and gambling activities within their own jurisdictions. Now, there is a pre-constitutional law called the Public Gambling Act, which has been adopted by certain states in India. However, most Indian states have enacted their own laws to regulate betting and gambling activities within their jurisdictions. Now, unfortunately, these laws that we have in India haven't really kept up with the times, and most of them still refer to gambling activities in physical premises termed common gaming houses. But what's perhaps most relevant is that most of these laws also call out an exception for what we call games of skill. And this is really where the entire Indian gaming industry really operates, is under this exception for games of skill. So now, what do we mean by games of skill really, right? The Supreme Court, in a series of judgments, has held that games of skill are those games in which there's a preponderance of skill over chance. So any game where the element of skill dominates over the element of chance, that's a game of skill, and you can offer that in most Indian states. Certain games have been recognized as games of skill by different courts. So, Ranjana, like you pointed out, Rummy has been recognized as a game of skill, and I'll, maybe get into that a little bit later. There is some states which have taken the view that poker is also a game of skill, and most recently we have a couple of judgments to support the view that even fantasy sports are a game of skill. And I'll also mention here that the Supreme Court has in fact recognized that you have a constitutional right to offer games of skill. They're legitimate business activities which any operator can offer. So yeah, to sum up, games of skill, they're legal and you can offer them in most Indian states. However, there are exceptions to this. Some states, for example, the state of Telangana has in effect prohibited all types of games by excluding the, by removing the exemption for games of skill under their law. And what I'll also mention here, and I think, again, Christina had touched upon this, is that most of these state laws are prohibitory in nature. So they either prohibit, particular games which are games of chance, or, they're not really dealt with under the law. However, in a few unique states, these games of skill are actually regulated. So the state of Nagaland has enacted a licensing regime for games of skill, and the state of Sikkim has also introduced a licensing regime for online games and certain sports games. So yeah, that's just a brief overview of the operative Indian gaming laws.
Okay, thank you so much, Tanisha. That's perfect. Actually, so the takeaway really quickly from that is there really is no license regime on a pan-India basis. You only have it on a couple of states, obviously. May not be the most ideal situation for an internet gaming kind of platform. And this is where it ties up with what Tina also said earlier, that it's not, they are the gray markets and then there are the white markets which are licensed. So keeping that in the background, I think my next question would be for you, Gowree. And because we have a fair good mix of the audience over here, some of them also from overseas as well, for the purposes of their interest, it would be really nice to know if there are restrictions for foreign investments as well as technology collaborations in this space, and if there are certain interesting ways in which that we could really overcome them as well. So over to you, Gowree.
Sure. Thanks, Ranjana. So, taking the thread ahead in terms of what Tanisha said, right? There is a clear distinction between the games of skill, which is considered as a legal activity, which is what let's call it, say, a skill gaming activity. And then you have a gambling activity, which is recognized as an activity or playing of, play for money with chance-based games. When you look at the FDI policy, which is the foreign direct investment policy, which really governs the investments coming into India, that policy clearly uses the terms gambling, betting, and lottery as a prohibited sector. So let's stay with this first. So when you talk about it's a prohibited sector, that means it's a absolute prohibition. So there should not be any confusion that, okay, with government approval, I will be able to invest or otherwise. It's a complete no. Hence, the question arises that when I look at these three words and read with what the Constitution, the way it has distinguished between the word gambling and non-gambling activity when it comes to, in relation to certain games, we can take a view that if it's a skill gaming activity, then it is not falling within this prohibition. And in fact, we have seen investments coming in this sector, which in the companies where the skill gaming has taken place. The issue, however, arises is the comfort of what we call as authorized dealers, because these are the dealers who essentially, are like gatekeepers for foreign direct investment into India. So if you have a clear-cut case ruling, like for example, in case of Rummy or earlier, in case of DFS, and we'll come to that in a bit. But when you have, these rulings, at least they have a view to take that, okay, basis this, I'm going to allow the investment, because otherwise, authorized dealers have no wherewithal to figure out whether to consider certain game of skill or certain game a game of skill or not. So this is one hurdle that always we, I'm also talking about some practical aspect here. This is one hurdle you will face because they will not be in a position to take a view. And therefore, you will find that for other games other than Rummy and DFS, you have had these situations where authorized dealers are not comfortable, right? But there are other structures, and I don't want to spend too much time, but there would be some structures where, for example, investment in a technology company, okay, which is sort of has a platform, which owns a platform or IP, but not itself operating the games. Maybe that is something they may be still comfortable because that company is not in the business of gambling or gaming for that matter. Right. So that is one aspect. The second aspect, as you rightly said, is a technology. Now there is a technology collaboration. There is some history here. So when early 2000s, there were a lot of confusion whether when an FDI is not permitted in this particular sector, are technology collaborations or trademark licensing permitted? And the government that time FIPB started getting queries whether this is permitted. Unfortunately, the government took a view that even technology collaboration trademark licensing is not permitted, right, for this gambling and betting sector. And that is why you see that being included in the FDI policy and now in the non-debt rules. So the issue remains that if the same view we can take that if it's a skill gaming activity and then you have to do technology collaboration and trademark license for skill gaming purposes, that is okay, but not for the gambling purposes. Again, there could be structures and structures, but I'm just giving the fundamental of law. Now, since Roland is here, I'm going to spend 30 seconds on this. In fact, we had a very interesting chat with Roland as AIGF that they should take the lead and make a representation, because this being a state subject, each state can have its own policy whether to allow gambling or not allow gambling. If that is the case, then why should a technology collaboration be controlled for something which is a licensed activity? To give an example, if Sikkim is allowing, say, a sports betting, for example, within their state, and that operator needs a foreign technology, that should be permitted because that is a valid legal activity within that state. So this is a representation that we have already made to the government. We'll see whether they accept or not. But this is a quick overview of the law and the policy initiative that we have taken.
Thank you so much, Gowree, especially for the practical insights. I think as lawyers, many times when we're advising the clients, we do end up telling them about how to interpret the law. But these practical impediments that you will face when you're trying to consummate the transaction are, I think, extremely relevant to know how practical your structure really is. And I think for the benefit of the audience, it's also relevant to say why technology collaboration restriction is very relevant when we're looking at the foreign operators or the investors looking at the Indian market. Because typically what happens is that on most occasions, they may not prefer to actually come in organically in the market because they may not really know the market well enough in terms of the consumer base and the likes and the dislikes. They may want to actually partner with somebody in India who has the kind of insight into the market and the local operations. And what the foreign investor slash what the foreign operator really brings on table is the the knowledge that they have about the game product, the knowledge and insight that they have, and the sophisticated platforms that they have in terms of the software as such. So given that, the foreign technology collaboration restriction becomes extremely imperative to deal with, and which is why this initiative with AIGF is probably going to be something to really look out for in the near future. And hopefully the government's going to see a lot of sense as to why we need to have this restriction removed as well. Now, this is probably a very good time to move into the product-wise discussion. So perhaps, Roland, I think I can pick your brains on this one. Let's talk about rummy and poker to begin with. You've been looking at this market for a while. Obviously, you've got a lot of these rummy poker companies as your members as well. What kind of an opportunity do you really have for rummy and poker? Is it a very saturated market, or do you feel that there's still a lot of room for investments, new players coming in? Or do you see now a shift towards perhaps more consolidation in the market to happen?
So we'll take one at a time. For Rummy, what we've seen, obviously, the background is that it's a older entrant into the industry, been around for almost 10 years. The stack up of the industry is also that the top three players practically garner about 80% of the market. And so, then there is the middle and the tail. As far as poker is concerned, so Rummy, to a certain extent, in terms of newer entrants, there are not too many. So looks like it has a steady rate of growth. And as far as poker is concerned, both have similar user bases, like close to what 20-25 million gamers who participate in these on a regular basis. And for poker, obviously, it's a slightly younger kind of audience. It's a newer entrant into the industry space as well. But obviously, the stack up is a slightly different for poker, where at least about 8 to 10 decently sized operators that function here. And there are newer players still emerging in the scene. As I said, it's a new business to begin with. We also have in poker, one of the international groups who took the opportunity and launched in India, the Stars Group, and now trying to consolidate. So as far as Rummy is concerned, I think there could be some consolidation there. As far as poker is concerned, I think they are the large 8 to 10, as I said, operators are looking at a national kind of a spread, and then there are some that are specific to certain regions. But I don't think real-time consolidation may happen. I think it's still some years away from now. But suffice to say that both are in the stack up for the industry that we kind of use as industry figures. Poker is close to about 450 odd crores, and Rummy is right up there at close to about 1,800 to 2,000 odd crores as a business vertical.
I think that's helpful, Roland. And I think especially for Rummy, we've already seen a lot of investment activity that's happened. I think in terms of the scale, it's probably a more mature set vertical of the industry today. And we do see a lot of foreign investment also having come in that. I think the next move might actually be consolidation, but who knows? That's how the world economics are playing out for this industry. And perhaps we'll see a similar trend for India as well. But I think what would be relevant to know for everyone would be, Tanisha, if you could tell us, if the position is settled for rummy and poker being games of skill, what kind of versions are really allowed under the Indian law?
Sure. So, to answer your question now, the question of whether a game is a game of skill or not is obviously a very fact-specific thing. So, when we discuss the principles which have been laid down by the courts on the skill element in game formats, we have to bear in mind that these were specific formats of the games which were being considered by the court, and the same holding may not apply for every format of the game. So, for example, I think poker, there's innumerable amount of variations to poker as well, right? And even rummy, there's different variations of the game. But I'll just quickly, discuss the sort of principles which have been laid down by the courts in respect of these two games, rummy and poker. So in the case of rummy, I'm sure that most of you must be aware, but the Supreme Court in a landmark ruling has actually held 13-card rummy to be a game of skill because of the skill that you require in memorizing the fall of the cards, and even holding and discarding games in rummy. And on a lighter note, I'm sure everybody is at home playing rummy during this period, so I don't have to convince you all on the skill element in that game. But certain state laws have also specifically recognized that rummy is a game of skill. So Nagaland, the licensing regime in Nagaland specifically recognizes rummy as a game of skill. Even the West Bengal law sort of makes an exception for rummy from their definition of gambling under that law. And the Kerala Act also has notified rummy as a game of skill. However, of course, subject to the exception that no side betting is allowed in rummy. The Supreme Court judgment holding that rummy is a game of skill, being a decision of the Supreme Court, is of course binding on all the lower courts in India as well. However, recently, there's been a slightly controversial Kerala High Court judgment which has come out, which is which Gowree will be dealing with I think a little bit later. So I'll just park that for now. So that's insofar as rummy is concerned, pretty settled position that at least 13-card rummy is a game of skill and can be offered in most Indian states. Now coming to poker. So again, there are some state laws which specifically recognized poker as a game of skill. So the West Bengal Act again culls out a definition, culls out poker from the definition of gaming and gambling under that law. Nagaland law also treats poker as a game of skill. But I'll just stop here again to say that the Nagaland law doesn't identify which format of poker is a game of skill. However, since the spirit of the law is to enact a regulatory licensing regime for games of skill, arguably only skill versions of poker should be allowed in Nagaland. And there have also been a couple of judgments of high courts, such as the Karnataka High Court and the Calcutta High Court, which have recognized that poker is a game of skill. So that's just a brief overview of how these two products are treated under Indian law, though of course it would depend on the exact format of the games being played.
And I think it will be the right time to also respond to one of the questions that the audience has put up. I think just to take a step back, the way the Indian law reads, there are no set guidelines that are there to assess whether something is game of skill or not. There are principles laid out, fact specific. So, for example, the Supreme Court judgment that Tanisha has been referring to is called the Satyanarayan case. And the Satyanarayan case was looking at rummy. So, there are certain principles laid out, set out over there. Similarly, you've got some other very helpful case laws, some looked at by the Supreme Court. There's a horse racing case as well of 94. It's called the Lakshminarayan judgment. And that talks about, the different facets which help you understand whether horse racing and therefore betting on horse racing can be a game of skill or not. So you look at a lot of these plethora of judgments to really figure out whether there are certain principles which can be applied to your game format as well. So that's just to answer one of the questions there. But I think this something that Tanisha said. She spoke about the Kerala case. Right time and the queue to go to Gowree. And now there are two very important cases. For Rummy, there's the Kerala order, and for poker, there's the Gujarat order, which I think Tanisha did not mention, but for the sake of everybody, there is an order of the Gujarat single judge that says that poker is not really a game of skill. Now, this is right now an appeal, and I'd love to hear Gowree's thoughts on how these two cases are going to have an impact on rummy/poker operators for their individual formats who are offering pan-India. Does it really affect the business pan-India? Does it affect only versus the state, or any other thoughts that you think are relevant for the audience here?
Sure. So let me take the Gujarat case first, which relates to poker, which is a single bench order. And I would say that if I really have to look at that order, I would say that the judge has not even given an order on poker game in the first place. Because if you really see, the description of the game that has been given itself is not an accurate description. So the question really arises is, whether the principles were even applied appropriately, because the facts themselves have not been articulated in terms of the description of the game. So that's the first, I mean, more as a side comment, but that's equally important when we are looking in appeal. So that matter is now before a two-judge bench before the same High Court, which is the High Court of Gujarat. And obviously, when one state has taken that view, it is valid within that state, because as we have always been saying that it's a state subject in India. So technically, it is binding within that state, though may have a persuasive value when the other high courts are looking at a similar situation, whether they will want to look at that case or not. But insofar as the legal effect is only within the state. So, however, we would keep that at the back of our mind when we are looking at overall business model as an exposure, or as a threat, if at all, what happens if the other states start following that model. But again, currently at least we have not seen other states have actually gone ahead and followed that yet, from a impact perspective. Now, coming to the actual case, in my mind, it will take another maybe, depending upon when the lockout gets up. But I think the arguments were supposed to start as we speak, but unfortunately they have been postponed. As and when that happens, if it is positive in favor of the industry, nothing like it. But if not, there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, when the appeal goes to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court gives a positive order holding it as a game of skill, as in the case of Rummy, then that finding, even though is given on a Gujarat law, right, it is given on the factual finding whether it's a game of skill or not, looking at the facts of the game format. In my mind, then we can argue that the same principle will apply throughout the country, because ultimately in all the other legislations also, the simpliciter exclusion of game of skill should be held to be applicable even to that game format, as we have seen in case of Ravi. So that's a quick, update on the poker aspect. Coming to again, another thing is, we need to also examine when the court is giving that order, if at all positive, even then I hope that the court articulates the game format accurately. The reason is because, as we saw, there are so many game formats. It has to be very clearly articulated, and unfortunately, that is the miss that we always see, where where the industry is not completely, or rather the format is not completely understood, creating confusion. Similar situation we had in Bombay High Court, interestingly, where the entire industry almost had a heart attack when one matter was about to be declared as having a poker to be a a gambling activity. But luckily, when we saw the FIR in that particular matter, which is the first information report, the game format was not the format of the poker game, luckily. So therefore, it was, though the FIR said poker, but the format articulation was not of poker. So finally, the judges were convinced to say that, okay, whichever game is articulated there may be a game of chance, but it is not poker. So, these type of issues do arise from state to state. And the reason I'm mentioning this, maybe we can take the issue later. There is a need for the industry to have some, sanity in terms of, being the central law availability. Now, coming to the Kerala case, and stop me whenever you feel I'm talking too much, because the Kerala answer is about, in my view, 1300-word answer, but I'm going to summarize in few few hundred words. So quickly.
I'm giving you 30 words. Would that work for you?
Okay.
You can go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So coming to the Kerala case, interestingly, as Tanisha mentioned, there is a notification which clearly says that the game of skill is excluded, and the notification was issued under one of the sections 14A of the Act, which allows the government to identify the games of skill and issue a notification. Interestingly, the court went on to read that notification to say that it simply says that rummy without side betting is excluded, but it doesn't say rummy for stakes is excluded, which is a very interesting interpretation in my mind, because the definition of gaming itself starts by saying wagering or betting. And when you have a section 14, which is which section clearly says that games of skills are excluded, that means that even if there is a game of skill being paid for money or for stakes, once you identify that it's a game of skill, that the exclusion should apply. But the High Court has unfortunately gone ahead and interpreted in a manner, and therefore the question remains that, and the way they have said that if at all it is being played for stakes, we will examine the issue on a case to case basis. That means from an industry risk perspective, there is a hanging sword that any time the police can raise a question that if you're playing for stakes, we will investigate into the matter. So there is no clear answer given, unfortunately, even in the review order by the court. The next question arises was whether that particular order applies to the online game operators, or does it apply only to the brick and mortar operators, right? Which is in a physical format. Unfortunately, there again, the court in a review order has not said that no, it does not apply to online operators. In fact, there is a statement by which you can say that the act may apply to the online operators, right? So because of that, those issues are left open in my mind, and I mean, the industry may be comfortable with living with the risk to say that okay, we will look at it on a case to case basis, but in my mind there is a constant hanging sword which ideally should be appealed, but unfortunately I don't think an appeal has been filed from that order. So I'll stop here and maybe take some other questions later on this.
Sure. So Tina, I know I've kept you silent for too long, but you can never put good advice silent for too long. So I'm going to bring you up now, but I'm going to give you a tough one, because I'm going to ask you something which is not just for rummy poker, but a little more across the board. Now, times are such, we are under lockdown, but there are interesting formats like daily fantasy sports, whose entire business model is actually around live events. And we had Roland also mention this earlier today. At the same time, you've got poker, where Tanisha mentioned about its legality. And I think a very important facet is Texas Hold'em and Omaha Hold'em are the two formats which might actually fly the skill preponderance test, but perhaps the other formats might not. At the same time, Rummy probably a little more stable, but there perhaps is room for innovation. Now, I think as an expert in this department, I think I'd really like to hear your thoughts on 2 or 3 specific aspects. One, do you really think there is innovation that India really needs to do? Number 2, what would your advice would be, for especially the DFS operators today, kind of grappling with the non-live event situation? What could they do to really keep their consumers engaged? And what's the world really doing today? There's so many global operators out there faced with the exact same challenge. So your thoughts on perhaps innovation in these 3 departments?
Okay, those are big questions. Firstly, I'm going to say thank you for calling me an expert. You've made my day. Thank you so much. I'm not sure it's true. I'm not sure there are any real experts. The whole global betting and gambling space is such a moving feast. So I'm going to take the kind of card question first, if I may. From my perspective, the poker bubble has pretty much burst. It's had its heyday globally. I'm sure most of you are aware, microgaming announced last year, Q3, Q4, they were going to shut their poker network. Playtech as well, which is the other big international poker operator, they too have kind of had to take action. Poker is just not what it used to be. And I think, as Roland mentioned earlier, you already have the world's biggest poker operator, PokerStars, resident in India. You want to take them on, you're going to need a fantastic product, but also a significant amount of marketing firepower. When it comes to innovation, I think for poker and for your card games, that's a real challenge. A lot of these card games, part of the skill isn't just counting cards or memory tests. It's also being able to tell if people around the table are lying. And it's also a game which requires a bit of commitment in terms of learning the game, but also time. And if you're going to add in innovation, there's quite a steep educational curve, as well as navigating what seems to be an absolute labyrinth of national and state rules. So for me as an operator, if I'm looking at perhaps entering the Indian market with the card games, I'd maybe stick with the traditional formats. So things like Rummy, Tea Party, both of which are enshrined in culture and pop culture. When Bollywood gets on the bandwagon, you know it's there forever. And I would perhaps kind of turn it on its head. What PokerStars have done incredibly successfully is get a female ambassador. Unfortunately, she is too young and too beautiful, and therefore slightly intimidating for a lot of females. But what I understand is you do have this kind of army of aunties with their lunch clubs and their Rotary clubs who actually play these games. So if I'm an operator and I'm feeling the pinch of consolidation, I'd perhaps reach out to these groups, which generally speaking, e-commerce, online has ignored for a long time. Reach out to them. They're all on Facebook. They're all on social media, and offer them the opportunity to take what they're already doing, but put it into an online community. Absolutely perfect when you're in lockdown and you can't do it physically. And perhaps, blend the social side with the actual card playing side of things. So in essence, the gaming side becomes secondary to the community and the social interaction. They're already doing both. Put them together. You're an operator, you've already invested in the technology, you've already got everything you need to do the marketing. Just got to put a slightly different slant on it. Pay-to-play freemium models, it's proven, and I think you mentioned at the start, Ranjana, that there is social gaming which is taking off at the social slot side of things. So it's just pulling all of that together. The DFS side, you're absolutely right. DFS is very much predicated on real events and the spectator experience, and everybody being an armchair pundit. Sports stocks, DFS is going to feel a pinch. I think some of the more imaginative DFS operators have perhaps started to look at esports. DFS is about a sporting event or a tournament. The same principles can actually translate to an esports tournament. And esports is huge in India. A couple of years ago, the highest earning esports player was an American Indian. So you've got a whole bunch of kind of Indian males have another hero, not just Bollywood and cricket, but esports as well. So that's a possible opportunity. But essentially, the way I look at it, daily fantasy sports, we call it sports, but you can apply it to anything where there's a winner. So there's, in theory, nothing stopping DFS operators being a little bit creative and applying the same principles of picking a winner to non-sports events. Could be a talent show, could be a cookery show. I think you take the principles, esports for sure, very natural for some replacement, but also cast your imaginative net a little bit wider. Not sure if that answers your question.
No, I think that's good food for thought. And I think the one message that is very clear is that innovation is the need of the hour for each of these game formats. And that's not just a situation in India. I think that's a situation globally as well. The force measure that we're experiencing is exactly the same everywhere. I'm very conscious of the time we have, so I am going to restrict the rest of the discussion to two major questions, which is really very important for us. But perhaps just to segue to that situation, I think it's fair to say that when we've been talking about DFS, the reason why DFS has also become increasingly popular is because also there have been certain decisions of the Punjab Haryana High Court as well as the Bombay High Court, which was in the case of Dream 11, the gaming unicorn of India, where the courts have blessed the format as a skill-based format for the portal. And I think using the same sort of principles, you could also test your own game formats. Rajasthan High Court is also the third court to have looked at this format. And I think DFS is a very close cousin that saw its birth in India. And I think something which Christina mentioned right at the beginning, sports betting was the biggest interest area that both domestic as well as overseas players had. But the biggest challenge in India today is the perception around sports betting. It's perceived to be something which is an illegal game format, not a game of skill. Well, each of us can argue it each way. There are enough arguments to say why it can be a game of skill, but the Supreme Court of India is looking into this matter in the case of Geeta Rani versus Union of India. So it's in a bit of a wait and watch mode to see whether it will be blessed as a skill format or not. But until then, you're always running the risk of being illegal. Now, my two questions that I mentioned, one would be to Gowree and one to Roland. So perhaps I can start with you, Gowree. We've obviously heard already in this session, there is no central legislation. There is a need of perhaps having a white licensing regime. I think from your experience and having dealt with the entire journey of policy formulation in this country in the last couple of years for this industry, how do you think India should really be approaching, well, not just sports betting, but just generally, licensing in India? Do you think the time is right for it? And, what do you think the next steps really should be?
My answer is very simple. We should have a central gaming law that deals with online gaming, right? And I say this for two reasons. One is for the industry, because as we saw during this conversation, each state is and the high courts of the relevant states are taking different approaches, right? Which creates a lot of uncertainty for the industry, even though you are a skill gaming, carrying out a skill gaming activity, right? So you need certainty to say that here is a regulator. And the reason I say online central law, because state by state, managing your business becomes very tricky, and there can be a constitutional argument also, which we don't have the time to get into, but we can argue that this should be governed under the central law. Once you have a central law, what will happen is you will have a gaming commission. You will have you will have a specific regime which can identify whether a particular game is a skill game or not, right? And you will have the highest level of consumer protection. So the most important reason I would want to have that kind of maybe not necessarily a fully regulated model, but a co-regulatory model where you can still have a room for self-regulation for some elements of it, but at least you will have an outline which specifies that the player protection measures that need to be implemented, such as self-exclusion, right, time management, or even the KYC requirements, highest level of KYC requirements, requirement of fraud detection. All these things can be handled in a very positive regulatory environment, which will give very good impetus to the industry, investments into the industry, including foreign investment, as also the player protection. Because today, I think Roland can probably deal with that more in detail on a self-regulation. We are trying to get, player protection in place. But the issues such as protection of player funds, do we need an escrow account? Because you cannot commingle your operating expenditure with the player funds. So all these things today, it is time has come that we don't simply rely on a gray area to say that okay, I'm in an exclusion category, skill gaming, and then that's about it. Time has come, the industry has matured enough to get into this mode, which will sort of give a good impetus as well as give player protection.
Very helpful thoughts, Gowree, and I do hope that India does move in that direction. But I think safe and suffice to say that's going to be a couple of years at the minimum. And I don't mean 2 years, I mean a lot more than that. But in the interim, I do know that our industry players are extremely conscious of the reasons that you mentioned of player protection, having some sort of stability in terms of business. Although the policies of each state are different, I know that the industry bodies have been doing brilliant work. In fact, I think 2 years ago, when Tina and I were in one of the regulator conferences, it was wonderful to see India being cited as an example in amidst so many regulators, where India's following a self-regulation framework. So uncommon. Nobody really wants to self-impose restrictions, really. Well, unless it's a COVID situation. But Roland, this one's really for you. And a very quick one at it as well. Could you throw some light on what are the initiatives you all have taken in terms of self-regulation, and what are you all really trying to do with it?
Yeah. So, as you are aware, Ranjana, we have, for each business vertical, some self-regulation mechanisms, and then you have some general do's and don'ts, general hygiene for the industry stakeholders to follow. And happy to note that, most of our member operators are abiding by that. And we have seen over the last last year, actually, a lot of these issues have come up, and because of the reliance on those starters, it has worked out well for all the stakeholders. I also want to mention, I think Tina casually touched upon it, but the digital esports side is also a business vertical where we work with you all at NDA to formulate some charter and some points that the people follow. That again, is to add to the card games and DFS, and now digital esports. Is also an industry that is growing, and like Tina mentioned, has immense potential. So we have charters for each of these categories, and all of them are being followed by the operators. And as in the next step, I had mentioned some months back that we would get into the audits. Happy to mention that that process has also started, and some of the member operators are also gone through the audit, which is also for us. And so this entire process, barring what you call the charter for advertising, which also along with NDA we had made the representation to ASCII, but we are in talks with them, and hopefully they should adopt it. But at the operator level, policy for the guidelines for advertising is we are trying to follow as much as possible in the intent. So those are it's right there on the AIGF website, and all our member operators right there.
That's a great example for the world community, isn't it? I mean, someone trying to self-impose restriction, and not just do that, but even giving teeth to the kind of self-regulation you're looking at, where subjugating yourself to audit processes, etc. So that's great work, Roland. All the best to you and your operators for keeping that Indian flag high, flying high for this industry. And with that, we come to the end of this session. Great takeaways. I think the three things that I've really learned from this session, and we've reiterated as a group: great potential, many more game formats. We're looking at esports probably being a new clear winner, along with digital skill gaming formats as well. COVID, no COVID, we will see the DFS industry come strong and hard very soon again. And at the same time, keep all your hats on, and let's work towards a policy shift. So the industry, together with the legal fraternity, needs to work hand in glove to really mobilize public opinion, as well as mobilize the different channels of the ministries in the country to have a central legislation in place. In the meantime, self-regulation is the way to go. And with that, thank you so much, Tina, Roland, Gowree, and Tanisha. We're dot on time, so I'm very proud to say we've been an extremely efficient panel. For all those questions that we've not been able to answer today, some of them have been extremely intriguing. We've tried to already address them, though we didn't call it out. But feel free to write into us if they are really, really important for you to know the answers to, and we'll be happy to take you through them. But with that, I'll hand this back to Mamta to draw a closure to the session. Mamta, over to you then.
Thank you, Ranjana, Gowree, Christina, Roland, and Tanisha for a very insightful and educative discussion today. Our next session will be held today evening at 6 p.m. IST on AR, VR, MR, navigating legal issues, followed by a session at 9 p.m. IST on patent issues in Indian technology sector. Stay tuned for interesting sessions every day. You can register on our website or through LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us, and you may now disconnect your lines.